Scripture reading this morning will come from Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need.
In our sermon series of Jesus and the different occupations that he has, or the different hands that he has, if you will, we've noticed a lot of different things that Jesus has done throughout his ministry. We notice that he has the hands of a carpenter, the hands of a builder. He has the hands of a physician, a healer. He also has the hands of a good shepherd, the hands of a writer, the hands of a fisherman. There are many different things that we see throughout the New Testament of things that Jesus taught and the things that Jesus did that proved him being the best that he was at what he did. But one that is very popular, if you will, throughout the New Testament is that Jesus has the hands of a high priest. Now, a few months ago, or a couple of months ago, we looked at Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 and how Jesus is better than Moses and Joshua and even better than Israel, that is, in succeeding where they failed. Well, if you recall that lesson, talking about how Jesus is superior and all these different aspects that proves him to be the best high priest, it leads into the actual occupation of Jesus's high priesthood, of Jesus being the high priest and what that looks like. And the Hebrew writer would allude to the job description of a high priest found in the book of Leviticus, and how there were so many different laws and regulations and things that not just the priests, but the high priest himself had to uphold, and the obligations that he had to follow. In Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 14, there's only 14 verses. It's a very short chapter, but in this short chapter, there is a lot to unpack here about Jesus being the high priest. And in this chapter, how we're going to break this down is in verses 1 through 4, we're going to look at the purpose and obligations of the high priest. The Hebrew writer would first start out by talking about just the high priest in general, what the man did under the old law and what his obligations were and what he had to do. But then he would transition into verses 5 through 10, the prophecies and the order of the high priest, talking about how there were men who filled these roles as high priests, but they never were able to do it to the fullest extent because they were not perfect. But there are prophecies, and there is the order of Melchizedek that this high priest comes from, pointing to Jesus the Christ, and we'll see that this high priest was prophesied over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament. And then we'll conclude in verses 11 to 14, the principles and oracles of the high priest. So he first talks about, in point number 1, this is what mankind attempted to do in being the high priest. Point number 2 is going to really discuss the nature of Christ and how he succeeded where mankind failed as the high priest. And then the last point, really the Hebrew writer rebukes the readers and the audience of, you should already know these things. I shouldn't have to tell you about this, but I can't go into great detail about these things because you're drinking milk when you should be eating meat. But because this is such a in-depth and deep passage, this chapter 5, we're going to break it up into two different lessons. This morning, what we're going to do is look at the first point and then half of point number 2. And then this evening, Lord willing, we'll look at the latter part of point 2 going into the Hebrew writer's conclusion of Christ's priesthood. Now, look at this passage with me in verses 1 through 4, talking about the great high priest. It says, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness. And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was." Now, let's break this passage down. In verse 1, we see the selection and sacrifices. Notice how the Hebrew writer, after chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, saying, we have such a great high priest who can sympathize with us. He says, now, I mentioned Jesus Christ as the great high priest. Let's talk about what it means to be a high priest. Look at verse 1, the selection and sacrifices. For every high priest was taken from among men and is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. Now, what I have here titled is the selection and the sacrifices, because the Hebrew writer says there's a process that leads up to the sacrificing. You have to have somebody offer the sacrifice, but it can't just be anybody. It has to be a very specific person. And it can't just be anybody throughout the entire world. It has to be somebody from among your own people. So look what he says, taken from among men. Every high priest was taken from among humanity. Notice that there were no angels. God himself did not give sacrifices of bulls and goats as the high priest did. He provided those things, yes, through, we see that with Abraham and Isaac. He provided a goat or a lamb to offer, but he himself did not offer it. The angel that stopped Abraham from fixing to sacrifice his son Isaac didn't offer up the sacrifice. Who was it that offered the sacrifice? It was mankind. Man had to be a part of this sacrifice ritual. Every high priest was taken from among humanity, not from among angels, who would not be able to identify fully with humans, as one commentator would say. Now, the reason that it wasn't angels is because angels were never man and never have been a part of mankind and understanding what we go through. So why on earth would God choose a man, a human, to be a part of this sacrifice ritual? Well, in order for Jesus to be the high priest, Jesus is deity. Now, he made mention that God never offered the sacrifice on behalf of man with the blood of bulls and goats, because that's what the high priest did. He would be the one to do the slaughtering of the animal and offer up the sacrifice with the individual giving that sacrifice. So how could Jesus be our high priest? Jesus would have had to have been both deity and human. If he is deity, we read about that in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But we also read about how Jesus himself said, even before Abraham was, I am. He said, I've been in existence forever. I haven't had a beginning. Jesus, how can you be our high priest? He would have had to have been human. Jesus would have had to take on flesh, take on the form of a servant, as Paul would say in the book of Philippians, so that way he could relate to us as humans. He could be our mediator between God and man. Now, look at what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Notice how the Hebrew writer stated this. He had to be made. He had to. There was no choice. In order for Jesus to be the sympathizing high priest, the one that can sympathize with everything that we go through, Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, He had to have put on flesh. John chapter 1 and verse 14, and dwell among us. Now, if you recall back in the book of James, James chapter 1, the introduction to the entire book, James says, God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust and enticed. And then he gives the progression of sin and how ultimately, when it is full grown, it leads to death. Well, hang on a minute. If God cannot be tempted with evil, how on earth was Jesus tempted? Because Jesus is deity. We read about that in Scripture. So how is Jesus able to be tempted in the same manner as we, yet without sin? Because he can't be tempted with evil. Well, the only way he could be tempted is if he was like us, mankind. Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4, he was led into the wilderness by the Spirit to be tested by the adversary. That means that Satan tempted him with evil. But you know what? Being tempted is not the sin. It's being drawn away by it and doctoring it and raising it up like your own child, as James would describe this process. When lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it leads to death. You see this idea of raising up a child. Jesus never raised up sin. He was tempted, but he was never drawn away by his own lust and enticed. He had things that he desired, but he never allowed those things to control and dictate his actions. That is how Jesus the Christ was able to be tempted in all manners such as we, yet without sin, because he was deity in the flesh. A lot of people say that Jesus was 50% man and 50% God. That's not what that means. He was 100% deity while also being 100% man. He fully understood what it meant to be God and to be holy and to be set apart, but he also now understands what it means to be tempted in every manner such as we. Now, that is how Jesus could be our high priest. He was taken from among men, from his own brethren, from mankind, but he was also deity. Now look at the sacrifice portion of this verse. Look at verse 1. Not only was the high priest to be taken among men, appointed on behalf of all men, things pertaining to God. So even there you see the specific work of a high priest. It's things pertaining to God. That they have to instruct mankind, their tribe under the old law, things pertaining to God and what it means to worship him. But look at this. In order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. So what was the role of the high priest? It was to offer sacrifices. That's what the purpose of the high priest was, to offer up sacrifice. Now, the selection part was from among us. Now, the sacrifice portion of verse 1, we see that it was for making atonement. Why on earth would the high priest have to give sacrifices on behalf of others? If you read in the book of Job, Job chapter 41 and 42, you read about how God condemns Job's friends for misrepresenting God. Because if you read throughout the book of Job, Eliphaz and the other two individuals who are just dogging Job, saying, you're a sinner. There is no way a holy man would go through this if he hadn't done anything wrong. And that's the way God thinks. God says, you have way misrepresented me. I'm not even going to accept your sacrifice. You go to Job and you let Job offer up a sacrifice for you, because I'm not even going to acknowledge your sacrifice. The high priest had to offer up sacrifices on behalf of those who were not worthy to give a sacrifice. But you know what? Under the old law, the high priest himself also had to give a sacrifice because he was human. That's why there were so many cleaning or cleansing rituals. They would have to take off all of their clothes. They would have to wash their body, their hair. They would have to change the clothes, and the new clothes they would have to wash and then put them on. Then they would be anointed with oil, and they would go through this process. And then they would have to offer a sacrifice for themselves for the sins they committed, and then say, now that I am clean, I can now stand in place of these individuals so that they can have a sacrifice and a relationship with God. Now, Jesus the Christ is our high priest. What does that mean? It means that he offers up a sacrifice that we never could. We can't offer a sacrifice as perfect as Jesus the Christ. And Jesus, being the high priest, he was the only one able to give a sacrifice that could appease God's wrath on our behalf. But you know what? He didn't have to give a sacrifice for himself. Do you know that? Jesus himself was the sacrifice. He didn't need a sacrifice for himself because he was perfect. He was deity. There were two main categories of offerings under the old law. If you read in the book of Leviticus, specifically the first 7 chapters of the book. Chapter 7 is a summary, chapter 7 and 8 are a summary of all of the sacrifices, just reiterating what God has told them to do. But in chapters 1 through 6, we see the specific sacrifices that are to be offered. And there's 2 main categories, the sweet-smelling aroma and then the without the sweet-smelling aroma offerings. Now, it's going to get kind of technical. Under these 2 categories, you had 5 total sacrifices, 3 under the sweet-smelling aroma and 2 under the not sweet-smelling aroma. You had the burnt offering, Leviticus chapter 1. You had the grain or meat offering, Leviticus chapter 2. You had the peace offering, Leviticus chapter 3. Those are the sweet-smelling aromas. Those would be considered the free gift offering. You do those out of your the goodness of your heart. But then there were those that you had to give. You got no choice but to give if you want to be right with God. That is the not sweet-smelling aroma. And these are the sin or purification offering, chapters 4 and half of 5. And then you've got the guilt or reparation offering, to repair. That's what it means, to repair. So you've got 2 different offerings that you had to give, which was an offering for sin to be purified and an offering of guilt, an offering to be repaired. Those 2 offerings, the not sweet-smelling aroma offerings, those were given by the high priest. Now, when we think of offering sacrifices, we really don't know what all goes into that because we never participate in it. If you watched these sacrifices, you would have to give the best of your best. You would bring it to the high priest, and the high priest would give you the knife. And you would have to lay your hand on the face of this innocent lamb. And then you would take the knife and slit its throat and feel the life drain from its body. And then after it dies, you would then hand that offering over to the high priest, and then he would follow the process of cutting it up and doing whatever it is that he needs to do. He would offer it. So it's not that the high priest did everything. The individual had a part in the sacrificial process. He or she just couldn't offer it. But they were the ones that had to slit the throat because it was their sins that caused that death. Now, the high priest, offers up a sacrifice of purification and repairing for us. And it was us that killed that lamb, but it was the high priest that offered it up. Jesus Christ is our high priest. And you know what's fascinating about, if you read in the book of Matthew, the one that's being written to the Jewish audience, it makes mention of in the 3 different hours set for Jesus being on the cross and during his trial and being falsely accused by the Jewish courts. While Jesus was being prepared for the offering, if you will, it was the exact same time that the sin offering was being prepared. So while Jesus is being beaten and slaughtered and hung on a cross, that lamb is also at the exact same time by the high priests in the temple are slaughtering and preparing this lamb. So when that lamb under the old law is being burned and killed for the sins of mankind under the old law, this new law is also receiving a sacrifice. And it's nailing this law. That way mankind doesn't have to do that anymore. And there is a perfect sacrifice offered up by the perfect high priest. We killed it. We slit the throat. but the high priest offered it up for us, Jesus the Christ. The sacrifice offered by the high priest were to atone for the sins of the people. The goal of, now notice this, the goal for every offering of the sin offering and the guilt offering, that is the not sweet smelling aroma, the one offered up by the high priest, the goal for those offerings through the high priest was to help maintain a good relationship between Israel and God. What is the purpose of the sacrifice of Jesus the Christ? It is to help maintain the relationship between the Christian and Jehovah God. But we don't have to keep offering up a sacrifice. That's the thing. That sacrifice was perfect. Therefore, we don't need to offer up another sacrifice, but we do need to continue doing our part, however, being a living sacrifice. Where the human high priest had to keep doing it, not just for the people, but for himself as well, Jesus completed the mission that every previous high priest had given himself to the task of accomplishing. Think about this. You're a high priest. And you, as a high priest, you started at around the age of 30, maybe 25, and you retired at the age of 50, I believe. You could still remain in the temple, but you no longer participated in the sacrifices. You are more of a teacher, teaching them how to do the sacrifice. So for about 20 to 30 years, your goal is to try to remain perfect. So that, because these people clearly are not. But for some reason, every single day, you still have to offer up a sacrifice for yourself. Jesus didn't have to do that. Jesus said, I am going to not only attempt to be perfect, I'm going to succeed in being perfect, because clearly these people are not. And I'm going to succeed where these high priests failed. I'm going to succeed where Aaron failed, where Eleazar failed, where Aaron's sons failed. I'm going to be the perfect high priest for these people. And I'm going to be the sacrifice, and it's going to be perfect. Now look at verses 2 through 3. The sincerity and sympathetic nature of the high priest. Look at verses 2 through 3. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness. And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins. As for the people, so also for himself. We already made mention of him having to offer up sacrifices, but imagine you being the high priest having to offer up the very first thing you do in the morning, even before the sun rises, is you have to clean yourself. You have to go through a purification process every single day. And then you offer up the sacrifice for yourself, so when sun rises, all of Israel comes to you with their offerings and says, I need a relationship with God. Please take this sacrifice. Can you imagine being the high priest and having to offer up sacrifices for 2.5 to 3 million people every single day? And they say, yeah, I sinned yesterday and did A, B, and C. Here's my offering. And you hear that 3 million times. After a while, you'll probably start thinking as the high priest, these are a bunch of idiots. They did this just yesterday, and I told them, don't do it, and you won't have to offer up a sacrifice for that sin. But yet, the very next day, you did it again, and you had to offer up the sacrifice. But you know, the high priest, they wouldn't just belittle them. They wouldn't try to make them feel about that small. They would be angry with the sin, but they would say, I understand. And then they would offer the sacrifice. Yesterday, after cleaning up the food, little Tommy was running around, and I was trying to help Haley with something. So I was trying to help Haley and also keep an eye on little man. And I would go back and forth, and then I would lose sight of Tommy. I was like, where's Tommy? And then I have to go find him. He's gotten into something. Tommy, come back. You got to stay over here. Then I go help Haley again. Then I lost him again. Well, then I look around the corner, and he's just standing there. His back is to me. I'm like, what are you doing? And then he turns around, and he's got something in his mouth. I'm thinking, what's in your mouth? And it was like some kind of beetle or some kind of bark from a tree. And I'm like, son, what are you doing? You don't need that in your mouth. And I was about to get on to him and discipline him. And I thought, I can't get on to him for that because I did that when I was younger. And I was thinking, I need to call my dad and tell him everything that Tommy's doing and ask him for advice on how to deal with it. And I was thinking, you know what, if I go to my father and tell him what my son's doing, I know exactly what he's going to tell me. In fact, first he's not going to say anything. He'll just start laughing and then say, well, you know you did the exact same thing. The high priest understood the weaknesses and the sins of mankind because they themselves were man. And this word to be gentle, or rather weakness, since he himself is also beset or subject to weakness, this idea of being weak or being gentle with the ignorant, the misguided, is not so much that he's indifferent about the sin of, I'll be gentle because, it's not really a big deal. I'll just calm them down. That's not the idea. The idea is it's between apathy and anger. He understands and he wants to help them, but he's angry at the sin, but he's not going to belittle them because he understands. That's how the high priest is described here. That's exactly how Jesus is. But you know what? He's like that even though he didn't sin, which makes Jesus an even better high priest than Aaron, which is exactly what the Hebrew writer is talking about. Jesus understands, he sympathizes with us because he's been in our shoes. He's been tempted in all manners such as we, yet without sin. Jesus understands. He has apathy, but yet he hates and he's angry at the sin, but he understands. And that's why Jesus is gentle and meek with us. We wonder, every day I have to say a prayer and ask for forgiveness for something that I did. How is God so patient with me? It's because he understands. Job begged for something like this. If there was only a mediator, if there was only an umpire between us who could call the shots of like somebody in baseball, strike one, strike two, he understands the rules and can guide these individuals. Job says, if I only had somebody like that to be the mediator between me and God, he would understand what I'm going through, but alas, I don't. But God was actually using Job as an example of what the mediator will be like. Job is a type of Christ, and Jesus is our umpire. He is our mediator and says, I understand, but you can do it. I've been there. I never sinned, but I've been tempted in every manner such as you. You can do it. Just don't follow this path. Go to this path. But you know what's going to happen? We'll thank him and we'll be pleased with the answer. And then the next day we'll come to him with another offering saying, I messed up again. And you know what Jesus is going to do? He's going to say, I understand. Jesus is the great sympathizing high priest who was taken from among men, but yet deity at the exact same time, who understands everything that we go through, yet without sin, and because of that, he is compassionate. He is gentle with us. Now look at verse 3. Sympathetic and redeemable. Because of the weakness of mankind, the high priest did sin and therefore had to have sacrifices for themselves. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 27. First for his own sins and then for the people's. But Jesus never had to offer that sacrifice. And look at verse 4 with me. Specifically chosen. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, when as Aaron was. The high priest couldn't say, well, I'll do it. I'll be the high priest. And they say, all right, since you raised your hand first, you can be the high priest. That's not how that worked. God specifically chose the individual to be the high priest. God chose Aaron. And after Aaron, there came another high priest. God chose him. And after that one died, because he's human, there was another one that came in to the office, but God chose him. Jesus, even though he's deity, didn't say, well, I'll be the high priest. He didn't do that. He waited until God the Father said, you will be my chosen one. You are the chosen. You're going to be the high priest. Jesus was chosen of God. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 58, verse 15 to 18. It says, but Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and warned them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen. That's God talking through Isaiah, prophesying about Jesus the Christ. Jesus was the chosen servant. And then look, there were consequences that fell upon those who took for themselves the honor and position of the priestly duties. If you look in Numbers chapter 16, you see the rebellion of Korah. Korah went up to Moses. Korah had a good army. He had a good support system, if you will. And they went up to Moses and they said, how come you get to be the leader and Aaron's the high priest? We want that role. And God, long story short, opens up the earth, eats them, and then crushes them inside the earth. You read about Saul, King Saul, the anointed of God. He was chosen to be king, but he was not chosen to be the priest. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 8, he tries to offer up a sacrifice. And if you read through that chapter, Samuel is walking away disappointed in Saul, and Saul grabs him by the tunic, and he tries to pull him back, but he rips off the tunic in his cape, and Samuel looks back and says, the same way you just ripped off my cape is the exact same way God is going to rip away the kingdom from you, because you tried to take honor and a responsibility that was not yours. Jesus did not take the responsibility. It was given to him, and he accepted it freely and humbly. Jesus is the perfect high priest, and he has a purpose, and he has obligations, verses 1 through 4. Now, we're going to get, hopefully, through half of point 2, and then the lesson will be yours, and we'll pick up this evening. But look at point number 2 with me, verses 5 through 10, prophecies and order of the high priest. So we talked about the physical high priest, that is humanity, and how they failed where Jesus is going to succeed. This is where the Hebrew writer is leading up to. He says in chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, we have such a great high priest who can sympathize with us, who has been tempted in all manners such as we, yet without sin. And they're probably thinking, what's the high priest do? He says, well, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at what the high priest does. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Now look at Christ as the high priest. Verses 5 through 10. Verses 5 and 6, a divinely chosen and ongoing high priest. Now we already touched a little bit on Jesus being the chosen servant, but look specifically at the quotation that the Hebrew writer reads or alludes to. Verse 5, so also Christ did not glorify himself as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Just as he says in another passage, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, he makes mention of what the human high priests didn't do. They themselves didn't take their responsibility and honor because God had to choose them. And if they did try to take it, like Korah and Saul and all of these individuals, then they would be punished. In like manner, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus was begotten of God. The quotation here is from Psalm 2 and verse 7. I will surely tell of the decrees of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. The psalmist says, Psalm 2:7. And then notice what Jesus says in his ministry. John chapter 8 and verse 54. Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. Jesus understood this doctrine, this teaching, and this fact. He says, even though I'm deity in the flesh, I can't glorify myself because if I do that, my glorying will be in vain. It's worth nothing. The Father has to glorify me. The Father has to choose and raise me up. I'm not supposed to do it by myself because that's not my role. it really shows Jesus's obedience to the law. Even though he was the lawgiver and is the lawgiver, he is also a law follower. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8 says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, that even though being in the form of God did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped." What that means is, even though he was deity, he didn't abuse his power. He used it justly. He used it correctly. And while putting on flesh the form of a servant, Philippians chapter 2, 5 through 8, he says, even though I'm deity, I'm not going to abuse my power. I'm going to fulfill my role and allow God the Father to choose me to do his will. That's what makes Jesus the perfect high priest. Now look at verse 6, the everlasting high priest. The Hebrew writer says, remember how Aaron was chosen, verse 4? There was the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood after Aaron. He says, well, Jesus is not after that type of priesthood, because only the Levites could come from that type of priesthood. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. And so for Jesus to be both a king and a high priest, he would have had to come by another order, by another priesthood. That's what the psalmist would say. Look at Psalm 110 and verse 4, the psalmist that the Hebrew writer quotes. "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." There's a second priesthood, the psalmist says, and it's not after Aaron. This priesthood is forever, which what does that say about the priesthood of Aaron? It's going to come to an end. Brethren, it's already come to an end. People say we still live under the 10 commandments, but they don't want to offer up sacrifices. They don't want to dress up like the priest. They don't want to go through the cleansing process, but they want to follow and cherry pick all the laws. That's not how that works. By the way, that law's dead. It was nailed to the cross when the king and high priest instituted his new priesthood, the order after Melchizedek. Now, the Hebrew writer would again talk about this order of Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 7 in the first 3 verses. It says this, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, king of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham appointed a 10th part for all the spoils, as first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of days, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually." Now, if you don't know much about Melchizedek, it's referenced in Genesis, I believe, chapters 12 to 14, when Abraham is leading up to trying to find land in the land of Canaan, and then there's the battle of the kings in the land of Canaan. The kings from the north and the kings from the south come down, and there is a grand battle, and Lot gets caught in the middle of it, and he gets taken captive, but one of his servants flees to Abraham and says, "Abraham, Lot's been captured. We need help." And in the process of going to save Lot, he meets a man by the name of Melchizedek, king and high priest of Salem. Well, we don't know much about Melchizedek except that he was a king of peace. That's what Salem is. A king of peace, a high priest of peace, and he was a high priest and king for God, Jehovah. But we don't read about his parents. We don't read about his children. We don't read about his genealogy. We don't even read about his birth or death, which is a type of what Jesus is. He says, in the same way that we don't have record of Melchizedek and his genealogy and birth and death and things of that nature, Jesus is going to be after that priesthood. Because that's the only priesthood that we read of that was approved of by God. That was not the Levitical priesthood. He was a priest perpetually. He continued to be the priest. And God says Jesus is after that priesthood because that priesthood can be both high priest and king, Who is Jesus? Jesus is our King, Acts chapter 2, and he is our high priest. He is our ruler and our great sympathizer. He is our great lawgiver, and he is our sacrifice. Jesus is the perfect high priest. Well, in verses 7 through 8, we read of a distressed cry and offering of the high priest. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put a pin in verse 7, and we're going to revisit this evening because we've looked at the obligations and we've looked at the specific laws that the priest has to go through, the formalities, if you will. We're going to look at specifically the emotional side of the priesthood. You know, remember we made mention of the high priest having to give sacrifices for thousands, even millions of people? That is not an easy task. In fact, dealing with humans day in and day out, 24/7, that's nothing but your job. You're going to start having this weight on you. You are responsible for keeping this relationship between the perfect creator and the imperfect creation. You are to help maintain that relationship, and it weighs on you as a high priest. Jesus has that. We see it in his prayers at Gethsemane. We see it in his crucifixion. Jesus did all of those things for us. And yet, we still have to show up and say, I messed up again. And Jesus says, I understand. If you have never gotten your life right with God through the perfect high priest, you need to do that today. Because I'll tell you right now, you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. And we can't be perfect and or be made perfect like Jesus the Christ if we're not in Jesus the Christ. Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. So if you have a need to become a part of this royal priesthood and follow our high priest, Jesus the Christ, come now as together we stand and as we sing.